the treetops as Detective Malachi Griffith climbed out of his battered sedan. The sun barely broke through the thick foliage, leaving the forest clearing in an ominous twilight. It wasn't the first time Griffith had seen charred remains, but something about this scene made his stomach clench tighter than usual. "Who found this?" he asked, turning to a young patrolman who was shifting nervously from foot to foot behind the yellow tape. "A local hunter, sir. He said he saw smoke and decided to check if there was a forest fire starting." Griffith nodded and walked past, pulling on his latex gloves. Forensic expert Raven Ellington, a small woman with eyes that had seen more death than most priests at funerals, was already working on the remains. The body, if it could be called that, was a charred mass barely resembling a human being. "What do you think, Raven?" "Female, approximately 30 years old," she replied without looking up from her work. "Judging by the condition of the remains, she died at least 3 days ago. Traces of an accelerant were found at the crime scene." "Murder?" "Without a doubt, she was killed first, then burned." Griffith rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Any ideas about her identity?" Raven pointed to a small plastic bag. "I found this among the remains. It's half melted, but you can still make out the engraving." The detective carefully picked up the bag. Inside was a gold necklace with a pendant in the shape of the letter K. It was partially melted, but still recognizable. "K? Kimani Zablon?" he muttered, remembering the missing woman whose case he had been assigned 3 weeks ago. "Possibly," Raven nodded. "We also found a burnt phone. The texts will see if they can get anything off it." Kimani Zablon, a 30-year-old beauty salon owner, went missing on the 23rd. Her friend, Zendaya Cornelius, reported her missing 2 days later, when Kimani didn't show up for work and didn't answer her phone. So far, there hadn't been a single lead. The detective examined the crime scene once more. Someone had gone to great lengths to prevent the body from being identified. But then, why leave the jewelry behind? Carelessness or a message? Back at the station, Griffith's first order of business was to request a full file on Kimani Zablon. A woman with no criminal record, she had moved to Memphis 5 years ago from Atlanta and opened a beauty salon in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. At first glance, she seemed like an ordinary, hard-working woman trying to escape poverty. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Griffith, detective, this is the lab. We ran the phone found at the scene. It belongs to Kimani Zablon. The last messages she sent were on the night she disappeared to someone named O. The content? Mostly arranging a meeting. The last message, 'I'll be at the church at 11. We need to talk. It's urgent.'" Griffith frowned. A church? There was no mention of religion in Kimani's file. "Which church?" "Not specified, sir." The detective headed first to the Crown of Beauty salon. The small establishment looked run down with dust on the shelves, faded posters of hairstyles and dried-up plants in the corner. The employees, 2 women with wary expressions, answered reluctantly, clearly hiding something. "She was a good boss," said one of them, Tisha, "but she hasn't been herself lately. She was nervous and often closed the salon early." "What about the customers?" "There were almost no regulars left. Business was bad." From them, Griffith learned the address of Zendaya Cornelius, Kimani's best friend. Zendaya worked as a bartender at a place called Blue Fire, a few blocks from the salon. Blue Fire was a typical bar in a poor neighborhood, dim lighting, worn furniture, and the smell of cheap whiskey. Zendaya, a tall woman with short hair and lots of small braids, was cleaning glasses behind the bar. When she saw the detective's badge, she visibly tensed up. "I already told you everything I know," she said before Griffith could introduce himself. "We found a body in the woods," the detective said bluntly. "It may be Kimani." Zendaya's hands trembled, and she almost dropped the glass. "What? No, it can't be." "Why not? Do you know something?" Zendaya lowered her eyes. I don't believe it." "Miss Cornelius, if you're hiding something—" "I'm not hiding anything," she replied sharply. but her eyes betrayed her fear. "Kimani was my friend. I want you to find whoever did this to her." Griffith decided to change tactics. There was a message on her phone about a meeting at the church. "Do you know which church she attended?" Something like panic flashed across Zendaya's face. "I don't know, maybe Holy Deliverance. She went there sometimes. She said the pastor there was inspiring." She said the word inspiring with a hint of bitterness. Next on the list of suspects was Javante Mercer, Javante's ex-boyfriend, a local musician with a shady reputation and a penchant for marijuana, but no serious criminal history. Griffith found him in a small recording studio in the basement of a run-down building. "Detective?" Javante smiled weakly when Griffith entered. "You again? Found anything?" "Possibly her body." The smile vanished instantly from Javante's face. "What? Where? How?" "In the woods outside town, someone went to great lengths to make sure she wouldn't be identified." Javante rubbed his face with his hands. Damn! I told you something happened to her. Where were you the night she disappeared?" "We already discussed that. I was performing at the Blues Hall. There were 100 witnesses. You broke up with Kimani a few months before she disappeared." "Why?" Javante sighed. "We just drifted apart, you know. It happens. She became kind of different, secretive. I thought she had someone else." "And who was it?" "I have no idea. Kimani wasn't the type to share, but I saw how she changed. New clothes, jewelry. She had to be getting money for that." Javante was clearly holding something back, but his alibi was easy to verify. After talking to Kimani's ex-boyfriend, Griffith went to Holy Deliverance Church, a small but well-kept building with a bright sign and calls for salvation on the walls. The Sunday service had just ended, and parishioners were leaving, casting curious glances at the stranger in a suit. Pastor Obadiah Hathaway, a tall man with a clean-shaven head and piercing dark eyes, greeted the detective with a professional smile. "Detective Griffith, how can I help you?" he asked, gesturing for Griffith to follow him into his office. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Kimani Zablon. I'm told she attended your church." The pastor nodded, his expression turning serious. "Yes, Miss Zablon was a member of our congregation, although I must admit not a very regular one. Her disappearance is a great tragedy. We pray for her every day." "When did you last see her?" For a split second, something resembling fear flashed across the pastor's eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. "It must have been a week before she disappeared. She came to the service. And on the night she disappeared, the 23rd? I'm afraid not. I was at home preparing my Sunday sermon. Can anyone confirm that?" The pastor smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I live alone, detective." Griffith took out his phone and showed him a message from Kimani. "She arranged to meet someone named Doe at the church. Anything you want to tell me, Pastor?" "Obadiah." This time the pastor couldn't hide his sudden pallor. He cleared his throat before answering. "I don't know what you're talking about. Are you sure? Because we have reason to believe that Kimani is dead, and the last person she planned to meet was you." "That's absurd," the pastor raised his voice. "I'm a spiritual leader, not a murderer." "No one said anything about murder, Pastor," Griffith remarked quietly. Hathaway faltered, realizing he had given himself away. I heard from parishioners that a body had been found." News travels fast. That was possible, but Griffith's intuition told him that the pastor was lying. "Can we check your car? Do you have a warrant?" "I can get one." They stared at each other until Hathaway gave in. "Fine, check it. I have nothing to hide." His car, a black SUV, was parked behind the church. At first glance it was spotless, not a speck of dust. "Suspiciously clean," Griffith noted to himself. He called in the forensic team to thoroughly examine the vehicle. It took time, but the results were worth it. Despite the thorough cleaning, the forensic team found traces of blood under the floor mat and in the trunk. Even a small amount was enough for DNA analysis. At the same time, Griffith dug deeper into Kimani's financial history. What he discovered explained a lot. The beauty-crowned salon was mired in debt. Kimani had taken out a large loan from a local loan shark, Lamont Preston, who was notorious for his brutal collection methods. The interest rate was extortionate, and Kimani was unable to pay off the debt. Griffith visited Preston at his office above a pawn shop. The loan shark, a stocky man with gold teeth and a scar across his eyebrow, grinned broadly when he saw the detective. "Malachi Griffith, long time no see." They had known each other since Griffith worked in the organized crime division. Preston had always walked a fine line with the law, but he was smart enough not to cross it. "Kimani Zablon," Griffith began without preamble, "she borrowed money from you." The smile vanished from Preston's face. "Yes, and she didn't pay a cent back. She ran off with my money." "Or she was killed." Preston shrugged. "If so, it wasn't me. Dead people don't pay their debts, Detective. I needed her alive." "When was the last time you saw her?" "A couple of days before she disappeared, she asked for an extension. I refused." "And what did she say?" "That she'd find the money." "She had a plan that may have included disappearing or a connection to a wealthy pastor." Griffith wondered how this story could have started. Kimani desperate for money, a pastor offering help. The picture was slowly coming together. Raven called late that night. "Malachi, the DNA results from the blood in the pastor's car. It matches the samples from Kimani's apartment." Griffith clenched the phone. "Are you sure?" 100%. It's her blood. And something else. We found traces of an accelerant on the pastor's shoes. He may have cleaned the car thoroughly, but he didn't think about his shoes. That was enough for an arrest warrant. Griffith went to pick up Pastor Hathaway himself, expecting resistance. But to his surprise, the pastor came out of the church with his hands up as soon as he saw the police cars. "You have the right to remain silent." Griffith began reading the rights while putting on the handcuffs. "I didn't kill her," the pastor said quietly. "Then explain the blood in your car and the traces of accelerant on your shoes." Hewitt was silent all the way to the station. Only in the interrogation room, after long hours of silence, did he finally speak. "We loved each other," he said so quietly that Griffith could barely hear him. "It was a sin, I know, but we loved each other, and that's why you killed her." "I didn't kill her." The pastor slammed his fist on the table. "She was desperate because of her debts. That night she came to me covered in blood. She said Preston had sent people after her. I tried to help. I took her to the hospital." "Which hospital?" "For Dr. Williams's private clinic. He doesn't ask questions." A check revealed that Dr. Williams' clinic had closed a week before Kimani's disappearance. Dr. Williams himself had left the country. "You're lying, Pastor," Griffith said wearily, "and you're only making things worse for yourself." "I didn't kill her," Hathaway repeated, but his voice was shaking. The final confirmation came the next day. Forensic experts found particles of ash from the crime scene in the back seat of the pastor's car, along with small bone fragments. A witness identified Hathaway's SUV near the woods on the night the smoke was seen. Everything pointed to Pastor Obadiah Hetty. Detective Malachi Griffith was certain the pastor had killed his mistress, burned her body, and buried the remains in the woods. Perhaps she had threatened to expose their relationship, or asked for money to pay off a debt. Whatever the reason, Obadiah Hetway was the last person to see Kimani Zablon alive, and he had no alibi for the night she disappeared. The courtroom was packed. It seemed like all of Black Memphis had come to watch the trial of the pastor accused of murdering a parishioner. Local TV stations were broadcasting live, and reporters were stationed outside the courthouse around the clock. Malachi Griffith sat in the front row, watching Obadiah Hetway's face. The pastor looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, cracked lips, his gaze wandering around the courtroom as if looking for an ally. The state of Tennessee versus Obadiah Hetty, announced Judge Wilson, a heavy-set man with graying temples and the weary look of someone who had seen too much human depravity. Charged with first-degree murder. Do you understand the nature of the charge, Mr. Hathaway? I do, Your Honor. The pastor's voice, usually strong and confident in his sermons, now sounded correct. The prosecutor, Chanel Ransom, an attractive woman with a sharp gaze and a reputation as a ruthless crime fighter, rose from her seat. Your Honor, this case is crystal clear. Pastor Obadiah Hetway entered into a sinful relationship with a parishioner, Kimani Zablon. When she possibly threatened to expose their relationship, he killed her, burned her body, and buried the remains in the woods. We have evidence: the victim's blood in the defendant's car, traces of an accelerant on his shoes, and witness testimony confirming his presence at the crime scene on the night of the murder. The pastor's court-appointed lawyer, a young and inexperienced man named Darius Patterson, was clearly nervous. Your Honor, my client denies the charges. Yes, he and Mrs. Zablon had a relationship, but he did not kill her. The blood in his car can be explained by the fact that he was helping her after she was injured. As for his presence in the woods, the only witness saw a similar car in the dark that cannot be considered reliable evidence. The judge adjusted his glasses. The preliminary hearing is now open. Mr. Prosecutor, call your first witness. The first witness was Raven Ellington, a forensic expert. She described in detail the condition of the remains found in the forest. The body was burned at a high temperature, presumably with the use of an accelerant, possibly gasoline. This made identification very difficult. However, we were able to determine that the remains belonged to a woman in her 30s, with physical characteristics matching those of Kimani Zablon. Were you able to conduct a full DNA test? Asked the prosecutor. Unfortunately, no. The high temperature of the fire destroyed most of the genetic material. However, we found partially burned jewelry belonging to Ms. Zablon and her cell phone near the body. And blood was found in the suspect's car, the DNA of which matches samples from Mrs. Zablon's apartment. The pastor's lawyer tried to cast doubt on the identification of the victim, Dr. Ellington. Is it possible that these remains belong to someone else? After all, there is no complete DNA test. Raven hesitated. Theoretically, yes, but all the circumstantial evidence points to Ms. Zablon. The next witness was Detective Malachi Griffith. He methodically outlined the investigation, how he came to the conclusion that the pastor was the last person to see Kimani alive, and how all the evidence pointed to him. We found traces of blood belonging to Kimani Zablon in Pastor Hathaway's car. Traces of the same accelerant used to burn the body were found on his shoes, and the victim's phone contained messages that clearly showed she had planned to meet with the pastor on the night she disappeared. The pastor's lawyer tried to undermine the credibility of the testimony. Detective Griffith, is it true that you have known Lamont Preston, Miss Zablon's creditor, for a long time? The man who threatened her with physical violence for not paying her debt? Griffith tensed. Yes, I know Preston. He's been involved in several cases I've worked on. And you don't consider him a suspect, despite the obvious motive. Preston has an alibi for the night of the disappearance. He was at a family celebration with dozens of witnesses. Then Zendaya Cornelius testified. She looked exhausted, constantly fidgeting with the hem of her blouse. Kimani and the pastor? Yes, they had a relationship. She said she was in love, that he was special. Ms. Cornelius, the prosecutor, stepped closer. Would Kimani ever mention any problems in that relationship? Threats? Violence? Zendaya shook her head. No, but she was afraid of something. The last time we spoke, she said she had a plan, that everything would change soon. A plan involving Pastor Hathaway? I don't know. She didn't give any details. The defense called several parishioners who swore that Pastor Hathaway was incapable of murder. but their testimony sounded unconvincing in light of the physical evidence. Obadiah Hathaway himself refused to testify, remaining silent throughout the trial. His lawyer argued that this was his client's right, but the jury didn't like it. The pastor's silence looked like a sign of guilt. The jury deliberated for almost 2 days. The tension in the courtroom grew with each passing hour. Finally, they returned with their verdict. In the absence of conclusive evidence, the judge read, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision. In accordance with the law, the court cannot return a guilty verdict without a unanimous jury verdict. The defendant is acquitted pending a retrial. The courtroom erupted in angry shouts. Kimani's relatives cried out about the injustice, while the pastor's few supporters thanked God for the miracle. But the main battle for Obadiah Ketwaya was just beginning. The press mercilessly spun the story. "Killer pastor escapes justice," screamed the headlines. Interviews with Kimani's relatives, witnesses, and experts filled the airwaves of local television stations. Obadiah Hathaway suddenly became the most hated man in Memphis. The church was the first to strike. The Holy Deliverance Church's Board of Elders voted unanimously to remove Pastor Hathaway from his leadership position. Regardless of the court's decision, said the new interim pastor, Isaiah Fulton, Obadiah Hathaway broke a sacred vow to God by entering into a sinful relationship with a parishioner. We cannot entrust our souls to a man who so easily succumbs to temptation. Hathaway tried to find another church, but all doors were closed. No religious community wanted to associate with a pastor who may have killed his mistress. Even those few who believed in his innocence feared public condemnation. The neighbors followed the church's lead. Hathaway lived in the church house, and the new leadership immediately asked him to vacate the premises. He rented a small apartment in the poorest neighborhood in town. It was all he could afford on his meager savings. "Get out of here, murderer," the children shouted as he walked down the street. The adults didn't shout, but their glances spoke volumes. It proved impossible to find work. Who would hire a man whose face was all over the television screens in connection with a murder charge? In the end, he got a job as a night watchman at a warehouse outside the city. No one asked any questions, and he was paid in cash. Malachi Griffith watched the pastor's downfall with mixed feelings. On the one hand, all the evidence pointed to Hathaway's guilt. On the other hand, something about the case bothered the detective. There were too many small inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. He sometimes came to the warehouse where Hathaway worked just to look at the former pastor. One night, he finally decided to talk to him. "Good evening, Pastor," Griffith said, emerging from the darkness. Hathaway flinched, but quickly regained his composure. "I'm not a pastor anymore, Detective. You know that." "Yes, I know. I also know that your life has been hell, but you know what's interesting. You didn't leave town. You didn't change your name. You didn't try to start over somewhere else. Why?" Obadiah was silent for a long time, staring into the darkness. "Maybe I deserve this hell, not for murder. I didn't kill her, but for other sins." "What sins? That's between me and God, Detective." Griffith adjusted his jacket collar. It was a cold night. "By the way, did you know that Lamont Preston is still looking for Kimani? Or at least his money?" This clearly took Hathaway by surprise. "What? Why? She's dead." "Preston doesn't think so. He says Kimani was clever enough to fake her death and escape her debts. What do you think?" "Absurd." But the former pastor's voice faltered. Griffith nodded, as if confirming his thoughts. "Perhaps, but if we imagine for a moment that Preston is right, then who do the remains found in the forest belong to? And what is your role in all this, Pastor?" Hathaway looked Griffith straight in the eye. "I didn't kill her, that's all I can say. But not everything you know is true, is it?" Griffith paused. "Good night, Pastor. See you later." Lamont Preston did not give up his search for his money. He was convinced that Kimani Zablon was alive. "She's too smart to just die like that," he told Griffith over a glass of whiskey at the Blue Fire bar. "And too cunning not to have a backup plan. Do you have proof?" Preston smiled. "Proof? No, but I know people. And Kimani isn't the type to give up. She would have found a way out. And that way out is to fake her own death with the help of a pastor, and then leave him to be torn apart by a mob. Isn't that a little too complicated? For 6 figures? It's possible." Griffith raised an eyebrow. 6 figures? You lent her $100,000? With interest, about $150 by the time she disappeared. That's a lot of money, Detective. Enough to kill someone or disappear. This information made Griffith look at the case in a new light. $150,000 was enough to start a new life somewhere far away from Memphis. If Kimani had really faked her death, she needed an accomplice. Someone she could trust. Someone who loved her enough to sacrifice everything. Someone like Pastor Obadiah Hathaway. But one detail still bothered Griffith. If the remains in the woods weren't Kimani's, then whose were they? An unidentified body they used to stage the scene? But where did they get that body? And how did they make sure the DNA wouldn't lead to the real person? Griffith decided to visit Zendaya again. He found her at the Blue Fire, as usual, behind the bar. "Detective," she nodded when she saw him. "What is it this time? I want to ask you a question that's been bothering me for a long time. You were Kimani's best friend. If she had decided to disappear to fake her own death, would you have known?" Zendaya froze, the glass in her hand trembling. "What nonsense! Kimani's dead. You found her body yourself. We found a body, but without a full DNA test. Stop! Just stop!" Zendaya's eyes filled with tears. "We buried her. We held a memorial service. Her mother still can't sleep at night. I just want to find the truth. The truth is that Pastor Hathaway killed her, and somehow he got away with it. But God sees everything, Detective. Sooner or later, justice will prevail." Griffith nodded slowly. "Yes, I believe that. Sooner or later, the truth always comes out." 6 months had passed since the trial. Obadiah Hathaway's life continued to fall apart. He lost his job as a night watchman when the warehouse owner found out who he had hired. Now, the former pastor eked out a living doing odd jobs, washing dishes in dingy diners, unloading trucks when he could. His health was failing. The once handsome man had become a shadow of his former self, emaciated, haggard, with a feverish gleam in his eyes. He talked to himself more and more, quoting passages from the Bible about suffering and redemption. Malachi Griffith continued to watch him, convinced that sooner or later Hathaway would make a mistake that would reveal the truth. He even helped the former pastor get a job as a janitor at the police station, partly out of pity, partly to keep him close. "Why are you helping me?" Hathaway asked when he received his first paycheck. "You're sure I'm a murderer?" Griffith shrugged. "I'm sure you know what happened to Kimani Zablon. Sooner or later you'll tell. Until then, even a murder suspect deserves a chance at redemption." Lamont Preston, meanwhile, continued his search for his money. He hired a private investigator who combed social media and databases for any mention of Kimani Zablon, or a woman who looked like her. So far, no luck. "She's alive. I can feel it," he repeated whenever he met with Griffith. "And she's out there somewhere enjoying life on my money." Griffith also began to doubt the official version. There were too many coincidences, too many oddities. He reread the case files over and over, looking for anything he might have missed. One evening, while looking through photos from the crime scene, he noticed something strange. There was something on the charred pendant with the letter K that he hadn't noticed before, a small engraving on the back. He enlarged the image and saw the date, March 23rd. It meant nothing to him, but it could be a clue. The next day, he showed the photo to Zendaya. "Does that date mean anything to Kimani?" Zendaya paled. "Where did you find that?" "On the back of the pendant that was on the body. That's her mother's birthday." Kapani always wore that pendant. It was further confirmation that the body belonged to Kimani. But then why was Preston so sure she was alive? And why hadn't Hathaway left town, despite all the suffering? The answers to these questions came unexpectedly, exactly 1 year after Kimani Zablon's disappearance. That evening, Detective Malachi Griffith was returning home after a long day. His thoughts were still revolving around the Kimani case, giving him no peace. At the same time, in another part of town, Obadiah Hedy sat in his tiny apartment, staring at the only photograph he had kept, him and Kimani in the park, happy, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, 3 short knocks. Just as they had agreed, Obadiah froze, unable to believe his ears. It couldn't be true. He slowly got up and headed for the door, his heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to burst out of his chest. He opened the door and saw her. Kimani Zablon stood on the threshold of Obadiah Hedy's apartment, like a ghost from the past. But she was real, with a new haircut, dressed simply, with anxiety in her eyes. For a moment they froze, staring at each other. And then, without saying a word, Obadiah pulled her toward him. They embraced with the strength of 2 drowning people clinging to their only hope of salvation. "You're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're really here." "I'm sorry," Kimani said softly. "I shouldn't have come back, but I couldn't. I just couldn't live like that anymore." He pulled her into the apartment and quickly closed the door. The small room, barely deserving of the name home, contained only the bare minimum of furniture, a worn-out sofa, a rickety table, and a single chair. There were no pictures or photographs on the walls, only a crucifix in the corner. "I've been watching you," Kimani said, looking around the shabby dwelling. "I saw what they did to you because of me." "It was my choice," Obadiah replied, never taking his eyes off her, as if afraid she would disappear if he blinked. "I knew what I was getting into." "But not this." Kimani shook her head. "You don't deserve this." They talked until midnight. Kimani told her how she had spent the last year in New Orleans, working as a waitress under the name Talisha Bencroft. How she had checked the Memphis news every day, following Obadiah's fate. How she had been tormented by guilt, seeing how their plan had turned his life into hell. "I thought you could start over somewhere else," she said, "that you'd be acquitted due to lack of evidence and just leave." "I couldn't leave," Obadiah replied quietly. "What if you came back and I wasn't there? I promised I'd wait." Those words made Kimani burst into tears. Obadiah hugged her, and they sat there for a long time, finding comfort in each other's presence for the first time in a year. The next morning, Detective Malachi Griffith was driving to work when his phone rang. It was Jerry, the officer on duty. "Griffith, you won't believe this, but Obadiah Hathaway is at the station, and he's with a woman who claims to be Kimani Zablon." Griffith slammed on the brakes, nearly rear-ending the car in front of him. "What? Say that again." "They're both here. They say they want to make a statement, only to you." The detective turned the car around and sped toward the station, breaking every speed limit. His heart was pounding like crazy. If this woman was really Kimani Zablon, then who had they buried a year ago? There were 3 people in the interrogation room: Obadiah Hathaway, the woman who had identified herself as Kimani Zablon, and a lawyer. Not Darius Patterson, but an elderly man named Solomon Thaddeus, known for his work on high-profile cases. "Detective Griffith," Thaddeus nodded. "My clients are ready to tell you the whole truth about Miss Zablon's disappearance, but before we begin, I would like to discuss the possible legal consequences and guarantees." Griffith struggled to contain his emotions. The woman in front of him looked exactly like Kimani in the photos. Only her hair was shorter and dyed. But was she the real Kimani, or a skilled imposter? "No preliminary agreements," the detective cut in. First I want to hear the story, then we'll decide who to arrest and for what. Thaddeus pursed his lips but nodded. All right, Miss Zablon. Tell the detective what happened. Kimani took a deep breath and began. It all started with a debt. I borrowed a large sum of money from Lamont Preston to open a salon, but business was bad, and I couldn't pay the interest. Preston started threatening, not just me but my family. I was desperate. She glanced at Obadiah, and their eyes met. By that time, the pastor and I had become close. I told him about my problems. At first, we thought the church could help with the money, but the amount was too large. And then you decided to fake your death? Griffith asked. Kimani nodded. That was my plan. Obadiah refused at first, saying it was a sin. But I convinced him there was no other way out. We decided that after my death, I would move far away and start a new life. Obadiah would stay and deny everything. We thought that without any solid evidence, he wouldn't be convicted. Whose body did we find in the forest? Griffith leaned forward. Here, Kimani hesitated. A homeless woman. We found her 2 days before I disappeared. She was already dead, an overdose, most likely. She had no ID on her. And you used her body to stage the crime, Griffith said, feeling anger rising inside him. You desecrated a dead woman's body and denied her a proper burial. I know, Kimani whispered, lowering her eyes. It's unforgivable, but at the time I felt I had no choice. Obadiah finally spoke. It was a sin. We both knew that, but I loved her and couldn't let Preston hurt her. And then you burned the body to hide her identity, Griffith continued. You left Kimani's jewelry behind so we would think it was her. Yes, Obadiah admitted quietly. I did it. And the blood in your car? It's mine, Kimani replied. I cut my arm on purpose to leave evidence. Griffith leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he had heard. And you, Pastor, were willing to sacrifice everything. Your church, your reputation, your freedom for her. Yes, Obadiah replied simply. I still am. Griffith looked at Kimani. Why did you come back? Everything was going according to plan. You were free, starting a new life. Kimani looked at Obadiah with such love and pain that Griffith felt uncomfortable, as if he were prying into something deeply personal. I couldn't live like that, she said quietly. Every day, seeing the news about how his life was being destroyed, I realized that freedom based on the suffering of a loved one is worth nothing. Detective Griffith ran his hand over his face. You realize you just confessed to a whole string of crimes? Desecration of a grave, obstruction of justice, fraud? We understand. Obadiah nodded, and were ready to face the consequences. The news of Kimani Zablon's resurrection rocked Memphis. Television, newspapers, social media, everyone was talking about it. Opinions were divided. Some considered Obadiah and Kimani criminals who deserved severe punishment, while others saw their story as a romantic tragedy, worthy of forgiveness. The Holy Deliverance community was in shock. Some parishioners were happy that Obadiah wasn't a murderer, while others were outraged by his deception. Pastor Isaiah Fulton condemned Hathaway's actions from the pulpit, calling them an insult to God and human dignity. Lamont Preston did not miss the opportunity to show off his insight. I told everyone she was alive, he boasted to reporters. Now I want my money back, with interest. Kimani's family was in turmoil. Her mother, Bertha Zablon, suffered a heart attack upon learning that the daughter she had mourned for a year was alive. But when she arrived at the hospital, her first request was to see Kimani. You broke my heart, girl, she said, looking at her daughter with teary eyes. But I thank God you're alive. The prosecution found itself in a difficult position. On the one hand, Obadiah and Kimani had committed serious crimes. On the other, the circumstances were exceptional, and public opinion was divided. In the end, they were charged with desecration of a grave and obstruction of justice, but offered a deal. Minimal sentences in exchange for cooperation in identifying the homeless woman whose body they had used. Malachi Griffith visited them in prison before the preliminary hearing. They were allowed to meet in a visiting room, an unusual privilege for defendants. "I'm still trying to understand," the detective said, looking at them across the table. "Why didn't you leave together? Why did you split up?" Obadiah took Kimani's hand. "It was my condition. If we disappeared together, they would have looked for us twice as hard. This way, I could draw attention to myself while she started a new life." "He wanted to come with me," Kimani added, "but he said it would look too suspicious, that I'd have a better chance this way." Griffith shook his head. "You know, I was sure you killed her, Pastor. All the evidence pointed to you." "That was the point," Obadiah replied quietly. "And you never tried to contact each other during that year?" They exchanged glances. "We agreed," Kimani said. "No contact for a year, and then I had to decide whether to come back or not. And you came back knowing you could be arrested. I came back because I realized that life without him wasn't worth my freedom." Those words made Griffith think. He stood up to leave but stopped at the door. "You know, there's a story in the Bible about King David and Bathsheba. They also sinned because of love." "And they were punished," said Obadiah. "Their firstborn son died, but then they had Solomon," continued Griffith, "the wisest of kings. Maybe there's a lesson in that." As he left the prison, Griffith ran into Zendaya Cornelius. "I came to visit her," she said. "You know I didn't know. She didn't tell me. I really thought she was dead." "I believe you," nodded the detective, "but something bothers me. The pendant with the letter K and Kimani's mother's date of birth. It was on the body of the homeless woman." Zendaya looked away. "Kimani lost it a week before she disappeared. She mentioned it. They must have found a similar one." Griffith stared at her until she gave in. "Okay, I knew something was wrong when they found the body, but there was no full DNA test. But I wasn't sure, you know, and if she really faked her death, then she had a good reason. You could have come to me." "And what would you have done, detective? Start looking for her so you could arrest her. What would be the point?" Griffith had no answer to that. The trial of Obadiah Hathaway and Kimani Zablon was a sensation. The courtroom was packed, crowds gathered outside, some with posters demanding harsh punishment, others calling for mercy. But the most dramatic moment came when Detective Malachi Griffith himself took the stand as a witness for the defense. "Detective," asked Solomon Thaddeus, "you investigated the disappearance of Kimani Zablon from the very beginning, didn't you?" "Yes," Griffith nodded. "And you were certain that Pastor Hathaway was guilty of her murder?" "All the evidence pointed to him. But now that you know the truth, how do you assess my client's actions?" Griffith was silent for a long time, looking at Obadiah and Kimani. "They committed crimes, that is undeniable. But I also see that they were not motivated by malice or greed, but by fear and love. Obadiah Hathaway was willing to sacrifice everything for the woman he loved. And Kimani Zablon returned, knowing she would go to prison because she couldn't live with the thought of her loved one suffering." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge seemed to hold his breath. "I've seen many real criminals," Griffith continued. "People without conscience, without remorse. These two are not like that. They have already punished themselves more severely than any court could." After a long deliberation, the judge handed down his sentence: 2 years probation for both and 500 hours of community service. They were also required to assist in identifying the homeless woman and provide her with a decent burial at their own expense. As they left the courthouse, Obadiah and Kimani were met with mixed cries of condemnation and support. Lamont Preston was already waiting for them with his lawyers, ready to demand repayment of the debt through civil court. "What now?" Griffith asked as he walked them to their car. Obadiah and Kimani exchanged glances. "We'll start over," said the former pastor. "Not here. There's too much pain associated with this city. We still have to atone for our sins," Keeman added. "But now we'll walk that path hand in hand." Griffith nodded. "I hope you find peace, and maybe, someday, forgiveness." As their car drove away, Griffith remained standing on the steps of the courthouse, lost in thought. He had seen many criminals in his career, but never before had he encountered a case like this. Where was the line between sin and victimhood, between crime and an act of desperate love? He didn't know the answers to those questions, but somewhere deep down he hoped that Obadiah and Kimani would find their way to redemption and a new beginning.